when President Nixon becomes the president, and he begins a policy known as Vietnamization. Vietnamization is Nixon's strategy for ending American involvement in the Vietnam War, and it basically just involves the gradual withdrawal of U.S. troops and replacing them with their South Vietnamese forces. Okay, so President Nixon and Henry Kissinger really tried to spearhead this process of Vietnamization. And part of Nixon and Kissinger's Vietnamization policy was aimed at establishing what the president called peace with honor. Nixon intended to maintain dignity in the United States in face of withdrawing from a war that really the United States doesn't win. So as Nixon is doing this, he's demanding that the South Vietnamese government remain intact, that the South Vietnamese troops take on more of a responsibility for the fighting themselves. And also at the same time, President Nixon's ordering that bombs continue to be dropped, massive bombing on North Vietnam, and also in countries not even involved like Laos and Cambodia. So it's an escalation of certain aspects of the war and a de-escalation in other certain aspects. So the escalation would be the bombing raids, and the de-escalation would be American troops are being sent home. So all the while, there's still trouble going on in the home front. Seeking to win support for his war policies, President Nixon appealed to what he referred to as the silent majority. It's a name that President Nixon gave to moderate, mainstream Americans who quietly supported his Vietnam War policies. So a lot of average Americans did support the president. The events of the war do a lot to divide our nation. And one of the events that happened that contributes to that division is a massacre, which we refer to as the My Lai Massacre, which happened in November of 1969. When it is published that month in the New York Times, a very shocking event. A New York Times correspondent by the name of Seymour Hersh reported that months prior, like 6 or 7 months before this, there was a United States platoon who went to a small village in Vietnam called My Lai in the northern part of South Vietnam. And this platoon was searching for Viet Cong rebels. They didn't find any sign of the enemy, so the troops rounded up villagers and shot more than 200 innocent Vietnamese, mostly women, children, and elderly men. One of the privates was interviewed in the article, is quoted as saying, "We all huddled them up and poured about 4 clips into the group," meaning they reloaded their weapons 4 times. Mothers were hugging their children, and they just kept on firing. This pretty popular with American people? Does this sound very American? No. The troops insisted that they were not responsible for the shootings, that they were only following orders of their lieutenant. When asked what their orders were, they said that they were told to kill anything that breathed, and that was their orders. As a result of this, 25 Army officers were charged with some degree of responsibility, but only the lieutenant, whose name was Calley, was convicted and imprisoned for war crimes, basically. So, stories like this that lead to our veterans being kind of mistreated when they get home, being called baby killers and stuff. They're just following orders. Calley was only imprisoned for a short time. President Nixon intervened and gave him house arrest. So despite the shock over the My Lai massacre, the country's mood by 1970 actually seemed to be less explosive. It blew over rather quickly. It did happen months prior to the news being printed. But American troops were on their way home, and that did a lot to soothe people's anger. And it finally appeared that the war was winding down. And then on April the 30th of 1970, President Nixon announced that the United States invaded Cambodia to clear out North Vietnamese and Viet Cong supply centers. This sounds more like more war. And President Nixon, had to defend his decision, his action. He said, if when the chips are down, the world's most powerful nation acts like a pitiful, helpless giant, the forces of totalitarianism and anarchy will threaten the world. So, in essence, he's, saying we have to continue on and continue fighting. Upon hearing about the invasion of Cambodia, which means more war, college students around the entire country burst into protest. In what became the first general student strike in United States history. More than 1.5 million students closed down 1,200 college campuses. It's kind of referred to as the most disastrous month of higher education in American history. These protests were not always peaceful, as violence happens on a lot of them. Disaster struck the hardest at a university in Ohio called Kent State. Kent State. College students are very creative with their signs. Now that picture is outside the White House, but they're protesting the same things. Now what happened at Kent State in Ohio is a massive student protest led to the burning of an ROTC building. ROTC is kind of like an officer training corps done through universities and high schools. So in response to this growing unrest, the mayor of the city in Ohio calls out the National Guard. And on May the 4th, 1970, the National Guard found themselves having rocks hurled at them. And in what they argued is self-defense, they began to fire live ammunition into the crowd. Who are they shooting at? College kids. Guys like just a year or two older than you. Shooting at college kids. The gunfire wounded 9 and killed 4, including 2 people who were just not even participating in the rally. This is not the only place where this happens. 10 days later, similar violence rocked the almost all-black college of Jackson State in Mississippi, where National Guardsmen there confronted a group of anti-war demonstrators and fired on the crowd after several bottles were thrown at them. 12 students were wounded, 2 were killed. Yeah. Glass bottles. This is the 70s.
What college was that?
I don't even think you could get Coke in a can then. Jackson State. So, America, deeply divided over Vietnam. And when they did polls determining who was at fault here, it was deeply divided whether it was the National Guard's responsibility or for these college students. It was split. Our nation was totally split. So, there's not really a good solution here. And then Nixon and Kissinger's Cambodia policy takes a huge hit when these things called the Pentagon Papers are published. Pentagon Papers are published. So what the Pentagon Papers were a 7,000-page document that members of the press had leaked to them by a Defense Department worker. So this is a guy that works in the Pentagon for the Department of Defense. And he leaks it to the press. It's secret, top secret information. And what this information is that it reveals that the United States government had not been honest about its intentions in Vietnam War to the American people. It shows that the government of the United States has been lying to people, Americans, lying to them about body counts, lying to them about the escalation of the war, lying to them about how many troops are killed, and lying to them about how much money is being spent. And it showed that there was no plan to end the war as long as the North Vietnamese persisted. Which at this point, this was already one of the longest wars in American history. So for many and it actually goes to the Supreme Court because the United States government found out that this information had been leaked, and it was the New York Times that was going to print it. And basically the government was like, you can't print this article. And they said, oh, yeah, we can. And so the government stopped them from printing it. And so they sued. And on what grounds? Yeah, First Amendment, freedom of the press. And it went to the Supreme Court, and the Supreme Court said the government has no right to restrict this. It is bad. It makes the government look terrible, and it's going to cause a lot of distrust in the government, but it's not a national security issue. And so the newspaper was allowed to print it. Now, if it was like national security risk, then they wouldn't be allowed to print it. Okay, the government can stop you in those instances, but it is printed, and for many Americans, the Pentagon Papers confirmed their belief that the government had not been honest about their intentions in the war. And this document was particularly damning to the Nixon administration, who supported what opponents of the war had been saying. So, because that's what the document does. So, it's not looking good. And so President Nixon somehow wins re-election and promised on his promise of peace. And basically he does one final push. So first they tried to do peace talks between American diplomats and the North Vietnamese. North Vietnamese troops rejected the American diplomats like Kissinger, and talks eventually break down in December of 1972. 2 days later, after the talks break down, President Nixon unleashes a ferocious bombing campaign against the North Vietnamese cities of Hanoi and Haiphong. Haiphong is Haiphong. Haiphong, the two largest cities in North Vietnam. These bombings become referred to as the Christmas bombings because U.S. planes dropped 100,000 bombs over the course of 11 straight days, only pausing on December the 25th. No bombing on Christmas. So at this point, calls to the war resounded from the halls of Congress. Even people in Moscow wanted it over. Everyone, it seemed, had finally grown weary of the war. The Russians weren't even, all they were doing was supplying the North Vietnamese, and they were tired of it. Everybody was sick of this war. So the warring parties returned to the peace table in January of 1973. And the United States signed an agreement on ending the war and restoring peace in Vietnam. What this does is, under this agreement, North Vietnamese troops would remain in South Vietnam. The war itself for America ends, but within months of the United States leaving Vietnam, the ceasefire between North and South Vietnam falls apart, and North Vietnam fully invades southern Vietnam. South Vietnam asks America for help again, And what's our response? We'll send you some stuff. Here's some supplies. So the United States provided economic aid but refused to send any troops. So did we win? Not even close. Killed a lot of people though, didn't we? Yeah, like 10-1. More Vietnamese died than Americans. But that's not how this war was going to be won. So South Vietnam soon surrenders to North Vietnam. And Vietnam to this day remains largely under the control of these forces. So the war leaves a very painful legacy. It's a painful legacy. The Vietnam exacted a pretty terrible price from its participants. In all, about 58,000 Americans were killed. 58,000 Americans died fighting, not counting the 303,000 wounded. Nearly a third of a million people wounded or killed. But compared to the North and South Vietnamese, whose death toll topped around 2 million, in addition, the war left Southeast Asia highly unstable. It is a highly unstable place, which led to further war in places like Cambodia. In America, our divided nation attempts to come to grips with losing, with fighting an unsuccessful war. Not something that we're really accustomed to, losing. So, in the end, the conflict in Vietnam left many Americans with a more cautious outlook on foreign affairs and a more cynical attitude toward our government. Hey, how many of you guys trust the government of the United States? Nobody's putting their hands up. What if I asked that in like 1950? You think every little boy and girl would have put their hand in the air? You think Vietnam had a lot to do with that? Yeah, it does. And several other things that are going to occur over the next few decades. So, while families welcomed home their sons and daughters, the nation as a whole extended a pretty cold hand to our returning veterans, which is really sad. There were no brass bands, no victory parades, no cheering crowds. Instead, many veterans faced indifference or even hostility from an America still torn and bitter about the war. Many Vietnam veterans readjusted successfully to civilian life, but about 15% of the 3.3 million soldiers who served developed post-traumatic stress disorder from the recurring nightmares and horrors that they experienced in war. Not to mention the many headaches and memory lapses that others suffered. Other veterans, in an attempt to deal with these psychological strains and problems, turned to either apathy. What's apathy? What's apathy?
Like lack to feel empathy.
What is it?
The lack of feeling empathy.
Okay, good guess. That's a good guess. Apathy?
It's when like you don't care.
You don't care. They just kind of gave up. They just withdrew from society. They're not going to do anything. Many, found themselves doing that. And if you don't do anything, where might you find yourself? Like you guys, poor. If you're very poor, where might you find yourself? Homeless. So homelessness amongst veterans went very high as a result of the mental illnesses that they contracted in the horrors of war. Others began abusing drugs or alcohol, and several thousand just outright committed suicide. So in an effort to honor the men and women who served in Vietnam, the United States government unveiled the Vietnam Veterans Memorial in Washington, D.C. You ever been there? Anybody ever been there? I don't have any pictures of it. It's just this big black wall that has all the names on it How many names are on it? 58,000 names, one for every soldier that died in Vietnam. It's a big wall, okay? So it's a deeply moving, even healing experience for a lot of veterans to go visit it. If you've ever been there, have been to Washington, you should. I recommend it. It's a good stop for tourists. But in the end of the Vietnam War, it ushered a period of violence in Southeast Asia. Communism still on the move. And just when we need to heal and we turn to our leadership for healing, and we're not really very trustful in the government, a whole scandal breaks out. Big scandal. And that's what we're going to talk about tomorrow. Okay?